Mike, you can see this?
Yes, sir.
All right, so perfect. Let me do this. All right, guys. Well, really what we're going to be going over today, grease interceptors, that's going to be our complete focus. And a couple of things I want to kind of give you guys kind of a quick digest of just the standards that govern grease interceptors, as well as the code digest. There's been some changes to the code if some of you are familiar with this. So Title 15 from DEP has actually made updates. They've been talking about this for the last 2 to 3 years, if not longer, on updating their code. So it's official. It's officially out. It came out mid-March of 2020. I don't think it's been published on their website yet, for the most part, but I've got a copy from Sophia in Plans Review had sent this to me of all the updates. And so what I'll kind of do is take you through some of what the old code said, and then I'll show you what the update says. A lot of it's going to be similar, but there are some drastic changes to the code. So we'll touch on that throughout the presentation. And then we'll touch on the grease production sizing method, on that sizing method, on how you can utilize that to give your client a pump out cycle. But more importantly, we could do a pre-approval. It's a free service through what we call Grease Monkey sizing tool, and we'll kind of touch on an example of that at the very end. So, so really, why are we here? Well, obviously, grease interceptors. One of the biggest causes of drains that you see like this is from fats, oils, and grease. It can also create sanitary sewer overflows. So it's really the one item. And I've been doing this now in the plumbing industry for almost 8 years. It seems to be this one plumbing fixture is such a hot spot in all these municipalities, where it's kind of the one thing that can trigger. If you don't service it, it could create major headaches and major expenses for the end user and city if it's not maintained. And so that's why we're here today, to talk about grease interceptors and everything that has to do with them. So the one thing I want to touch on first is the standards that govern grease interceptors, and I'm really going to highlight 2 of them. There are different variations of these 2 standards, but PDI G101 and ASME A112.14.3 are the 2 that I really want to kind of dive in here. So PDI G101, this is one of the oldest standards in today's plumbing industry. This was developed in the late 40s, and this had actually came apart where the U.S. military wanted to come up with some way to use grease, fats, oils, and grease to make ammunition. And so PDI was a little bit of a part of that, on that development, on how they came apart. But one thing with PDI, it is a proprietary standard. And so we always consider this the good old boys club when looking at this standard. And it really touches on a couple key things. And 2 of those is it must have a minimum average efficiency of 90% or more to meet this standard. It also, with your grease interceptor, you must have 2 pounds of grease storage for each 1 GPM. A couple other requirements with PDI G101, and some of you guys have obviously designed several kitchens, and the external flow control. This is a requirement if you're using a PDI G101 certified tank. This is required. This is required in front of the inlet. It's part of the actual design of the whole standard. And what this does is basically it brings air. As you can see, the air intake right after the orifice of the flow control, it brings air in, and it's supposed to make the grease molecules larger and so that they rise faster within the system. So this is required. If you're specifying a unit that's PDI, you have to make sure that you allow space to put this external flow control in. Another requirement that you see on a lot of these PDI G101 standards is that there's a lot of typically they're using baffle designs to help slow down the flow with inside the interceptor. And so most of these PDI G101 units come with an external flow control and baffle designs. I want to mention this too, just on the testing, because code doesn't really go into this. It just says, hey, you got to meet PDI or ASME. Well, what does that even mean? And so I want to show you guys kind of a takeaway on how what a lab looks like on when we're testing these grease interceptors. And so you're going to see here when I go into ASME, it's almost identical to what PDI G101 on how they test. And so number one, basically we're using lard and we're heating that up to 160 degrees. And the ratio with this lard before you put it into the to the test sink is that you're basically using 1 pound of lard for every 5 GPM that you're going to certify. And so do the math here. If I'm certifying a 100 GPM interceptor, I'm using 20 pounds of lard on every single test run that's incorporated within the testing agency. So step number two, it basically looks at, now we're mixing the lard within the test sinks, and the sinks are filled with 160 degree water, and the heated lard is introduced into those sinks. And so that's what number two is. And then number three, sinks are drained in time to ensure flow rate GPM accuracy. And so now all we're doing here is literally funneling the flow and putting it down into number four, which is the effluent passing through the grease interceptor. And so number five is basically a skimming tank. And this is where we look at the efficiencies. Remember, you have to have an average efficiency of 90%. And so that means that you can actually have 10% bypass and you still meet the standard of PDI. And so that's what this skimming tank is. And then number six, all of this is a dewatering station, and it skimmed the lard water mixture is dewatered and measured to ensure that the minimum 90% average efficiency is maintained. So you just continue to do this until the interceptor drops below that 90%, and then PDI would certify it to the minimum capacities. And so those minimum capacities that you guys see here, again, we're looking at minimum requirements. If we're certifying a 20 GPM interceptor, we just have to meet with PDI 40 pounds of grease. And so you'll see kind of how Title 15, they pretty much take this from PDI and they make it their own into their own Table 1 and Table 2. And we'll touch on that here in a second. And so that's really kind of a short summary of PDI. ASME is very similar on how they operate. And so what ASME is not a proprietary standard, it's more of a consistent standard, which it has more than just the drain line manufacturers creating a standard. It has engineers, other municipalities created this standard, and this was developed in the early 2000s. So it's a newer standard. It's in all the national plumbing codes, IPC, UPC, National Standard Plumbing Code in Maryland, Jersey. And so this is also listed within Title 15 as well. You'll see ASME right there, right next to PDI. And so I want to mention that because sometimes you hear through the grapevine, well, it's got to be PDI. Well, no, it doesn't. It could be PDI or ASME. The code mentions both of them. Just PDI has been around forever, where ASME is a new developed standard. A couple of the key touching points on ASME, again, it also has to have a minimum average efficiency of 90% or more, but also ASME allows you to certify the interceptor to their maximum grease capacity. That's extremely important because it allows you to test until it fails. It also allows you to engineer the grease interceptor on how you would like to see best fit. And so there's actually 4 types of flow controls that you can design your grease interceptor to. So type A is identical to PDI G101, units with external flow controls with an air intake directly connected. Type B is also a different variation of PDI G101, units with external flow controls without air intake vent directly connected. I don't think there's a Type B on the market today. No one's been able to certify to Type B, but Type A is basically PDI. And Type C and Type D, Type C is units without external flow control directly connected. That is what all the Schier Great Basin series are. We have a built-in flow control with every one of our interceptors. So for you guys as designers, that's a huge feature. You don't have to figure out where that fitting goes with the air intake. You literally just pipe right up to our inlet. That's, footprint is crucial, especially within the 5 boroughs or even in Manhattan, to try to figure out where to put this fitting and the air intake. There's no space in the kitchen. In Type D, units without external flow controls indirectly connected. So Schier, in the past year, we've actually certified to Type D, and specifically all of our outdoor models that can also go indoor, but specifically going outdoor, all those are Type D certified now. So we're pretty excited to be first to market, not only with Type C and Type D. So let's look at how we certify. Again, guys, it's identical to what PDI G101's doing. And I'm not going to go through this again, but again, there's 6 steps, but you do it till failure. And so when looking at our grease capacities with some of our models here, you can see we're not the minimums like you would get with PDI. So a PDI, let's just say 100 GPM interceptor would be 200 pounds, where ours is, 1,751. And so, and actually, we've actually recertified it, and we're actually over 1,800 pounds now. But even looking at our let's just say GB2 model, it's dual rated. At our 50 GPM, instead of being 100 pounds, we're 127 pounds. So we're always giving you more grease capacity, which is going to be a great thing for your guys' clients, because they now can extend their pump out cycle because we hold more grease. And over time, that's going to save them a lot of money, especially when having to service these interceptors all the time. So that's a little bit about the standards, with the standards that govern grease interceptors. And specifically, we touched on PDI G101, and we touched on ASME A112.14.3. So at this point, I'm going to go into the code digest, and the 2 codes that we're going to look at today, really Title 15 dictates everything with the School Construction Authority, or what we call CSA. But I do want to point out CSA on some of their requirements. They have not updated their code recently, but Title 15 has, and we'll touch on all those updates. And I think that's going to be really important for you guys when you submit through plans, to make sure that we're staying code compliant and we're meeting the integrity of the code.
Hey, Paul, quick question that came in. Just wanted to verify, are Type C and D units approved by plumbing inspectors in New York and New Jersey?
Yes. Great question, by the way, but yes, they are approved. Keep in mind, though, the code does not touch on A, B, C, D. The code just says ASME or PDI. ASME, when you dive into that standard, that's when it mentions the 4 types. But the actual plumbing codes do not go into that much detail. You just have to be ASME. And if you're ASME, it doesn't matter what type you are, as long as you meet that standard. Good question. So going back to CSA, and really I'm just going to do a quick dive here on CSA. There's not much, digest here to really look at, but when looking at the design requirements or mechanical services, and this is found in section 6.0, really what it touches on here, and I'm not going to try to read this word for word, but I want to point out that, again, if you look towards the last paragraph here, it shows PDI G101 and ASME A112.14.3. And so again, going back to the last question that we just touched on, it's not going to ever say type B, A, B, C, D. As long as you meet those standards, you are good to go and you're approved. But the thing that's a little bit different with the CSA, you actually have to approve your brand or the unit itself. It's not like if you meet Title 15, CSA is going to automatically approve you. No, you have to go meet with those folks and make sure that you get listed on their code. And so going to section 15415 of drainage, you'll see here it touches on, again, the interceptors shall be designed and tested in accordance with PDI G101 and ASME A112.14.3. And then it does say, or 14.4. 14.4 is for grease removal devices. Those are your automatic ones that have the skimmers. That's what that standard is for ASME. And PDI G101.2, which is not listed in here, that also touches on that actual grease removal device standard. And so again, on this section of the code, it just talks about a little bit on how the manufacturer with the acid resistant coating inside epoxy coating, or should be fully fabricated with acid resistant materials, which if you're steel, you have to have some sort of epoxy coating. If you're shear, we're high density polyethylene, we're already acid resistant just based on our material that we make it out of. And this is where I want to touch on, guys, that just because we're meet Title 15 doesn't mean we're going to be accepted by the SCA. And so SCA, you actually have to be put within their code. And so you see here, it lists other manufacturers as well. You know, Watts, MyFab, Joe Sam, let me see, Rockford, and then you see Schier Great Basin Series. And so again, we're listed within SCA. This is extremely important that you follow this code, because this is what all the engineers there at the SCA is following. You have to be able to be approved in this, or you cannot get installed in the public schools. Now again, SCA is everything public, not private sector. It's all public schools within the 5 boroughs. Next slide here. Here we go. There we go. Mike, you want to pull up one of the polls now? I've got question 1 up on the screen, and I'll just go ahead and read it. What are the 2 standards that govern grease interceptors from Title 15 of the rules of the City of New York? Mike, and I'll wait for you to let me know when I should move on.
Yep. Yeah, we've got about 30% voted. We'll just give it another 30 seconds or so and make sure everyone has a chance to click on the answer. Again, you can select, you know, you got to select the 2 standards. So you can click the 2 that All right, we'll close that one out.
All right.
Back to the presentation.
All right, guys. So that's question 1. Now I'm going to dive into Title 15. So again, jurisdiction, 5 boroughs is what we're looking at here. And so this is going to be a great digest, because there's been changes to the code. And I don't know if everyone's aware of that. I actually tried to research on their website a little bit in the last couple days, and I'm not even seeing this published on their website yet. But it is supposedly, you know, through Plains Review, that this has been live since mid-March. And so if anyone needs a copy of it, just let Mike or I know, and we can easily send you the new PDF of the new code. So let's dive into it. So one of the things I'm going to show you guys here, obviously they show numbers on what's what. I'm going to show you what the previous code says, and then I'm going to show you what the new code says. A lot of it's going to be the same language, just with some additions, and I'll make sure to actually touch on what the new stuff is. And so as you guys can see here on the screen, I'm not going to read through all this, but basically where required, if you're producing fats, oils, and grease in a commercial kitchen, it's mandated that you have a grease interceptor, bottom line. And so this kind of touches on some of those types of food service establishments, kitchens, clubs, butcher shops, slaughterhouses, fish markets, supermarkets. The only thing it does say, non-residential establishments where grease may introduce into the drainage system. Keep in mind that sizing, sorry, it's hard. Give me 1 second, guys. Okay, there we go. Sizing of the grease interceptor shall comply with the criteria specified in these table 1 and table 2s. Again, non-residential does not require, or I'm sorry, residential does not require grease interceptors. And so that's like condos, things like that, or nice apartments. So let me go back here. Okay, so the update, what was updated within this was that they added community centers, catering halls, ice cream and yogurt shops, coffee shops, tea shops, donut shops, pastry shops. Basically, where fats, oils, and grease is introduced to the interceptor or the drainage system, you got to have a grease interceptor. And so really, the update is basically adding on a couple more what I call FSCs, food service establishments. That's what's been updated on number A. The other thing I want to mention, guys, is that where you see where it says where required, that no longer is there anymore. It just says A, and then you just read it. This is literally a snippet from the new code. And I'll show you here throughout this presentation. I've just basically took snippets of the code, and we'll just touch on it throughout the presentation. So A, update part 2, this is brand new because it never talked about gravity grease interceptors in the code in the past. Title 15 only mentioned everything to do with basically hydromechanical. Hydromechanical has everything to do with those certifications, PDI and ASME. Gravity grease interceptors do not follow that whatsoever. And so the other update, part 2 of A, is basically saying to determine the corresponding minimum size for gravity grease interceptors, such minimum flow rate in gallons per minute shall be multiplied by 3. And so, if you have a 100 GPM unit is what you size it to based on hydromechanical, you just times that by 3, and now you're looking at flow rate in gallons per minute is now 300. The resulting number shall be the minimum storage capacity in gallons. So basically, instead of going with a 100 GPM unit, if you're going with gravity, you need to go with a 300 liquid gallon capacity. I doubt that there's any room to install a gravity grease interceptor in any of the 5 boroughs. Maybe in Staten Island, but maybe parts of Queens, but there's no space to put a large gravity grease interceptor in. It's physically almost impossible. So I don't see this being utilized a lot, but it's there. You can go that direction now if you really want to, versus going with the hydromechanicals. And so, but one thing you want to keep in mind, that hydromechanicals are engineered systems, or engineered grease interceptors, where gravity grease interceptors are not. They're basically septic tanks with no standards associated with them. So if I was you guys, I would keep with the certified systems and not go the gravity direction. So moving on to type B, I'm sorry, not type B, but section B. The previous code said required standards, and then it gave a description of what that is. And remember, we've touched on this quite a bit so far. Basically, the standards are PDI and ASME shall be installed in accordance with the manufacturer's instructions. So the update gives a little bit longer description, but there's not much that's changed other than all the stuff that's been underlined. But at the end of the day, it still tells you got to be PDI or ASME to be able to be installed within the city. And so that's really what it's touching on here, guys. It does give a description on just on some of the installation, on the ability to perform a dye test and things like that on the waistline. So that's an addition to the code. But again, guys, we can get you a copy of this after. I don't want to like read this word for word, but you can see the updates. They've added a lot more language, and you'll see that throughout the presentation. And I believe the previous code was maybe 4 to 5 pages. The new one's up to like 10 to 11. That's how much more language they've added. And it's always underneath these numbers. Yes.
Quick question. Are grease interceptors even required for community centers with warming pantry kitchen, which is a non-cooking kitchen?
That's a great question. If it's just a warming kitchen, it just depends on the fixtures. If it's a 3-comp sink, I mean, if you have fixtures that are in a commercial kitchen, they're going to require a grease interceptor. But if it's literally like a sink that you would have it, you know, like your house with no a normal dishwasher, they would probably consider that more residential. But I would almost want to go through plans review to have them tell us that versus me saying something that might not be necessarily true. But that would be something you want to take up. Say that again.
Isn't that the same thing as like Facebook or Google putting in like a pantry kitchen that, you know, they've been required to have a grease interceptor?
It all depends on exactly what they're doing. And I would say no, it's not the same, because Facebook and Google, we have a lot of installs at their campuses in Silicon Valley, and they're full-fledged kitchens. They're not like it's not like a kitchen, you know, that we would have at our office. It's a lot more advanced than your typical kitchen. So again, it all depends on the fixtures that are within that food service establishment. And I would say, based on the new code, guys, they're going to make you put a grease interceptor in.
Echoing what you said, one of the attendees commented that plumbing inspectors will require a GI for any compartment sink.
Yep. Yeah, good question, guys, though. Yeah, pretty much if it's producing fats, oils, and grease, they're going to want to see an interceptor. All right. I'm going to move on here to, let me see here. Okay, C. So we all seen these table 1, table 2. Again, this has been updated. And we're pretty excited about the update on these table 1 and table 2s, because we've been preaching, Mike and I, for the last several years to DEP about how they need to update the pounds, because as you guys know, with Schier, we are certified way past the minimum capacities, but the initial code was written to the minimum capacities. And so if you were to go by pounds, you could actually get in trouble with a smaller interceptor, because our GPM holds a lot more pounds. And so the nice thing with the new code, it's all been updated. They've thrown GPM in next to the pounds, because it's just not people like Schier. Other manufacturers are certifying now past the minimum capacities. And so all this says is you got to be minimum flow rate. The pounds isn't really the trigger point anymore. It's really meeting the intent of that flow rate is how you're sizing. And so I highlighted, I kind of squared off the old code going back. It only went up to, at least the two tables in the old code basically went up to 400 pounds or 200 GPM. New one goes all the way up to 2,500 GPM. So nothing out there exists at that GPM. And so to accommodate a GPM that high, you're going to have to start putting tanks in parallel to accommodate a GPM that high. And so the nice thing with Schier, we actually have the only certified 200 GPM unit on the market. No one's able to certify up past 100. I take that back. I think there's another manufacturer that actually certified to 150, but no one's actually certified to 200 GPM. So our GB250 is dual certified to 100 and 200 GPM, but also we have a GB500, which is third-party tested at 100 GPM, but we've factory tested it at 500 GPM. And so DEP's accepted that tank from us. And it's just minimum capacities. Again, it's factory rated 500 GPM, 1,000 pounds, but you could put those in parallel to easily achieve that 250 GPM if you're working with a massive kitchen with that many fixtures that you could potentially have. So I'm going to continue here. Quick sizing note, just basically pretty traditional. Take the dimensions. I just threw a really simple example here. 18 by 18 by 18 to get cubic inches. That's for one single compartment. You need to times that by 3 bowls if we're sizing a 3 comp sink. We get 17,496 cubic inches. Let's go back to the graph or the table. Since a 3 comp, you would technically go to table 1, not table 2 on this one. And since that 17,000 falls between the 15.4 and 21.5, or I mean 21,560 cubic inches, if we just had a single 3 comp sink, minimum capacity is a 35 GPM or 70-pound interceptor. So that's just a quick example. I just wanted to kind of take the group through. Also, again, this is from the previous code here. Language that tells you how to add up the capacities if you have more than one fixtures, on how to do that between table 1 and table 2. Pretty self-explanatory. And so this kind of goes into a little bit more detail. And so I want to show you the update on what that looks like. And so this is the update. Again, not much has changed. You won't see anything highlighted here. You still add them like you did in the previous code. When you have multiple fixtures that fall into table 1 and table 2, you still add them together to get basically the bottom line of what you're looking for that GPM. And so this is a snippet of the new code. Again, not much has changed between the sizing. But one thing that I've noticed is that they're requiring larger interceptors. And so you'll see that obviously if you're submitting through plans where maybe in the past you could get away with smaller ones, they're wanting to see even larger ones, again, to prevent sanitary sewer overflows and getting grease blockages within the plumbing pipes or the sanitary sewer systems. So I'm going to go on to D. And again, old code said flow control, new code just says D. This was from the old code. It just mentions vented flow control shall be installed with flow capacity. The grease interceptor specified by the manufacturer is not exceeded. And it kind of touches on that. Again, type PDI is type A, where ASME is all 4 types. So I want to show you, remember the external flow control with the air intake? That's on the inlet side, where Schier, if you look at the photo down below, we use what we call a flow control cartilage. It just sits right on what we call our inlet diffuser. And so this is, again, nice for you guys as designers. You don't need to make room for that external flow control. You just pipe right up to the inlet, and it saves a lot of time on the install, which I've heard from contractors, it could be anywhere from an hour to an hour and a half. But more importantly, it saves space on your design to try to fit this interceptor in within the commercial kitchen. And so again, type D update. This is what it looks like from the new code. It just touches on, again, I don't want to read word for word on this, but I do want to show you what it looks like. And this is taken from the new code. As you guys can see here, there's a little bit more language in there from what the previous code says. So this was the previous code on what it said for D, and this is the updated. So you can see it's a little bit lengthier in what they're talking about. They've added a little bit more language within the code. So I'm going to continue, guys. I'm going to continue to E. And again, old code, minimum grease retention capacity. It basically said grease interceptors must have a retention capacity in pounds of at least twice the numerical flow through rate in gallons per minute. So this looks very much like what you see in table 1 and table 2. Update, this has changed quite a bit. You can see it's all been highlighted from Sophia. Grease interceptors and automatic grease removal devices must be rated by flow rate in gallons per minute and grease retention capacity in pounds. Grease interceptors must have a grease retention capacity in pounds of must be at least twice the numerical flow through rate in gallons. So it has to be at least twice that. It could be a lot greater than that, but it can't be below that. Both the minimum required grease interceptor capacities in pounds and minimum required flow rate in gallons per minute must satisfy when determining grease capacity and automatic grease removal devices sizing. So I threw 20 GPM 40 pounds on there. Again, it has to be that minimum. Remember, where Schier is well past that. That's going to be a good thing for your clients. They can extend their pump out cycles versus going with the minimums.
Hey, Paul, quick question.
Yep.
When you mentioned that the 6 inches above the flood rim, is that of the 3-compartment sink or of the grease interceptor itself? I believe you intended for the above the that's the indirect connection, right?
So yeah, grease interceptors and automatic grease removal devices must be equipped with a device to control the flow, or to control the rate of water flow so that the water flow does not exceed the rated flow. The flow control device must be vented and terminated not less than 6 inches above the flood rim level or be installed in accordance with the manufacturer's instructions.
Above the grease interceptor.
Correct.
Yeah.
Good question there, guys. All right, going on to F. Old code, not much has changed with the new one, but this is the old, what it said, minimum 90% efficiency. Grease interceptors shall remove in an average of 90% efficiency. New code basically says the exact same thing. Shall remove an average 90% or more of the grease matter in the wastewater before their rated grease retention capacity is exceeded. So again, that's where the standards come in play. That's basically a PDI and ASME standard that you have to be rated more than 90% efficient. And so that's where you see it within the code. So I'm glad they touch on that within the code. So not much has changed with F. G, minimum temperatures were 180 degrees. The temperature of water entering a grease interceptor shall not exceed 180. That's important because obviously PVC is not accepted within the city. It's cast iron pipe and whatnot, but this is good, just, standard practice, guys. Once you get out the city, you can actually use PVC in a lot of other jurisdictions, except in these larger like union cities like Boston. I believe Chicago's like that, as well as Philadelphia. It's all cast iron. But when you get out of that in the suburbs, it's all plastic. And so plastic piping could actually only go up to 140 degrees. And so this is good. We always recommend when you get into these high temps that you should put like some sort of water tempering valve to kind of cool down the water before it actually enters the interceptor. And so code mentions it. G update basically says the same thing. And I'll just kind of read a little bit of this, except where only waistelines discharging water above 180 degrees are connected to such interceptors or devices. The department may require a dedicated grease interceptor of sufficiency capacity for waistelines that only discharge water above that. So now old code said, nope, we won't even allow 180. New code says, yeah, that's kind of the max, but if you do exceed that, we're going to require a separate interceptor to be designated on that line only. So there's a little bit differences there, but very similar. H, old code. Again, old code, one thing I've noticed, it's very brief descriptions that were written within each number, letter. Basically, it just says it needs to be accessible for inspection. So just looking at this photo, this is not accessible. One thing that we say on our installation guide from Schier, we say that you have to have at least a minimum of 5.5 inches above the cover to the bottom of the sink or the 3-comp sink to be able to make it accessible, to service it, to allow the inspector to kind of look inside of it. And so we actually say that on our installation guide. New code, it adds a little bit more detail. And it talks about how the authorized employees of the department, again, it just wants to make sure that when they do inspections that they can clearly get access to these tanks at an easy rate. Because again, I think there's like over 30,000 restaurants just in Manhattan alone. There's a lot. If they're doing inspections correctly and they're hitting all these places, they need to be in and out fast. And so that's why this is so important. So think about that when you guys are making designs, just to make it easier for these guys to get in and out, because that's something that's really important to them, for the inspectors, so that they can just get access to it and they don't need all these extra tools to, you know, open all these doors or whatnot, to remove all this other equipment that might be on top of it. They just want to go in, look at it, and get out of there to make sure it's code compliant. So Mike, I'm going to hit you with question 2 and question 3. So go ahead and open the polls again. Question 2 reads, what is the minimum grease interceptor efficiency allowed by Title 15?
All right, we got that one up, Paul. Just as we're waiting for responses on the questions, we had some, on the poll, we have some questions that came in. So, one was, are dishwashers required to connect to the DI? And I know that depends on certain factors, doesn't it? Some of them do.
That's a great question. I'm actually going to be answering that here within the next couple slides. So could we just hold off? I think I'll answer their question here in the next couple slides.
Yeah, we can hold off on that. We've got 78%, so I'm going to close out number 2 and move on to number 3.
Perfect.
And so the other question we had was in regards to the flow control and venting. Now, does our flow control need to be vented, given that it's an internal type flow control?
Great question. Ours does not need to be vented. There needs to be a vent after the interceptor. That's for everybody. But with our interceptor Schier, since we're certified with a built-in flow control, we do not need a vent on the inlet side of the interceptor. Where PDI, you would. Now, one of the things I do want to mention, we do recommend a vent on our interceptors if the interceptor is installed on the floor below. We do that to relieve some of the head pressure, because if you have an interceptor, let's just say in like a basement and the kitchen's above, which just happens all the time in New York, we would recommend a vent, and that's literally to relieve the head pressure before it hits our inlet pipe.
All right, that we wrapped up those. Well, we got one other question. I was under the impression only 2 compartments of a 3-comp sink were to route to the interceptor. What if degreaser is used for dishwashing?
Great question. Yes, the code does not want sanitizers or degreasers routed to the interceptor. So if your 3-comp has that, you're only going to route the 2 sections of that 3-comp to the interceptor. You're not going to route all 3 sinks. Sorry if I confuse you guys on that. I know the example I threw up there was a 3-comp, but that is correct. And the reason for that, guys, just to kind of maybe get in the weeds a little bit, and I'm glad they say that, because when you start throwing in like sanitizers or degreasers, or even like, and I'll show you, there's a new section, a new letter to the code that actually touches on some of this stuff. What happens is emulsification starts to happen. and where the grease has a really difficult time to separate from the sanitizers or the degreasers. And so when it comes into the system, if it's all mixed in with like the soaps and stuff, you're going to see where it's just not going to have enough. It will actually, the soap will leave with the grease basically. And so that's why that's a requirement. And I think it's a great requirement because it helps capture more grease within the actual commercial kitchen by not having all those degreasers, enzymes all connected within the system.
Okay.
Cool. All right. So we got question 3 all done, Mike?
Yep.
Perfect. All right. Moving on, guys. We're going to be looking at I. And again, I'm hitting you again. As you guys seeing this, I'm hitting you with the way the old one said it, and then I'll show you the new way. So there's not much difference between the new and old way on this one. This really touches on scraper sinks. Basically, scraper sinks shall be sized in accordance with Table 2. That's why you see Table 2 right here. Basically, the minimum capacities need to be at least 30 pounds or a 15 GPM. Again, old code talked in pounds, new code talks in GPM, which is great. Here's the new way. Excuse me. So it adds in, again, 15 gallons per minute. That's kind of the new addition to it instead of just saying 30 pounds. But also shows you that the minimum cubic inches, again, is 3465. So again, there's not much change between this other than it's now listing gallons per minute. So that's good to know that. As well as going back here, yep, scraper sinks. I don't know, not sure why that was highlighted because the old way said that as well. So not much change here other than the gallons per minute was added. I'm going to go to J. Now, this is going to answer the question that was written about what about dishwashers? This is a great question. So old way, automatic dishwashers convert total volume to cubic inches. So this is basically saying if it's an automatic dishwasher, basically whether it's connected separately or in conjunction with other fixtures, the total volume in gallons of each automatic dishwasher shall be converted and shall be looked at. Table 2 is where you're going to find this to figure out what the GPM is based on the cubic inches. So that's the old way. New way, discharges from automatic dishwashers which use chemical sanitizers must drain to a grease interceptor. So remember the old way, that was something that they did not want to see chemical sanitizers connected, where the new one says, yes, it should be. And so you'll look here as well, guys, the minimum flow rate of the required grease interceptor device as per Table 2 for a single rack automatic dishwasher must be equivalent to the dishwasher's discharge rate in gallons per minute as indicated on the manufacturer's specification sheet based on the number of gallons of water. Give me a second here. I've got water the device uses per wash cycle or a minimum of 1100 cubic inches, which is greater. And so it also kind of going down here, if it's a multi-rack automatic dishwasher, must be equivalent. And so this is where you'll see a minimum if it's multiple racks of 2200 cubic inches, which is ever greater. So again, you're corresponding this all to Table 2. So this is what the new code reads versus the old way. So a lot more detail on what's said. And this is interesting because it actually kind of touches on this next section on K. I feel like these are kind of interlinked now.
Hey, Paul, before we get to K, there's a question that came in on J. Does that mean all 3 compartments of the 3-compartment sink should go to the GI, even with chemical sanitizers?
That's a good question. I would say the old way, no. I would have to check with plans review on that. I don't want to tell you yes or no, guys. Let me get back to you on that. I don't want to tell you the wrong answer there, just because.
All right.
Yeah.
And then another question was, is there anything in the code requiring heat tracing on grease waste piping? Which
there
I
is
don't
not.
believe there is. Yeah.
Yeah. There's nothing that mentions that. That's a great question. Most codes, and I don't believe this code says anything about having the interceptor as close to the fixtures as possible. And that's where, let's say if you're like, I'm just going to throw a number out, 50 to 100 feet away. The reason why you guys would want to maybe look at heat tracing is just to make sure that the grease doesn't coagulate to the cast iron piping. You're going to find it where it's going to try to stick to that type of piping a lot more than PVC. And so, yeah, if it's pretty far away from the interceptor, I would definitely consider heat tracing it just to make sure that the pipe between your fixtures to the grease interceptor doesn't start creating a blockage where the grease starts sticking to it, because it's starting to cool down and it will start to stick to it. So that's a great question. Code does not mention anything, but it does come up quite a bit. Should I heat trace? We always look at that. We always kind of consider working with the designer on that aspect, just depending on how far away it is. Now, if there's dishwashers and things connected to it, I would say you're probably not going to need to heat trace it, because you're putting out high temps to begin with. So there's really no reason to heat trace it, especially if the kitchen's in operation, for majority of the day, if they're serving lunch and dinner or breakfast, lunch and dinner. So it all depends on several situations if you should heat trace.
Yeah. Now, guys, good questions coming in. We'll keep answering them as we go. If you have a more specific question that you want to get on, you can certainly, I can unmute you and you can ask Paul directly. So just keep them coming in on the question bar. Thanks.
Great question, guys. All right, so Kay, high temp automatic dishwashers with sanitizers don't need to go to the grease interceptor. That's what Kay used to say. Excuse me. So now it says discharges from high temperature sanitizer cycles or automatic dishwashers from a dedicated sanitization compartment of sinks must not drain to the grease interceptor or automatic grease removal device, except where only waste lines discharge water above 180 degrees are connected to such an interceptor or device. The department may require a dedicated grease interceptor. Again, that goes back to the temperature. It kind of restates that. So I think that answers the question that I could not answer prior, because it also mentions the sanitizer compartments off of sinks. So if I'm seeing this right, this is saying that the discharge from a high temp sanitizer cycles must not drain to a grease interceptor unless if the temperature is above 180. Going back to Jay here, this says from automatic dishwashers with chemical sanitizers must drain to the grease interceptor. So I think they've defined it as if it's an automatic dishwasher with sanitizers, it should go to the interceptor. And then Kay is saying if it's a high temp, that's the difference, guys, then it shouldn't go to it, unless if it's 180. So I feel like there's language in there that kind of leaves it up to the municipality to kind of do what they want here, because it's more than just one variation that can decide if the dishwasher is getting connected or not. So just keep that in mind, guys. And the nice thing is, towards the end of this, I'm going to show you a way that if you fill this out on a certain software that we have, we'll be able to answer all these questions for you before you actually go through plans. But I hope that answers the question about the single compartment sink that's using that high temp sanitizer cycles. Moving on to L here. So one thing to keep in mind, L, floor drains. This is the old way on what the code says. The new way does a great job of really kind of identifying the different diameters. And I'm not going to read all through this, but there's highlighted on what this is, and I'm just going to give you a brief summary of what that looks like. So the takeaways is that basically if you have a floor drain, and again, the old way really just kind of touched on that, 1540 cubic inches. And I think it's great that they've put floor drains with a 4-inch, 5-inch diameter, and 6-inch. They tell you exactly what cubic inches you need to get the associated flow rate with it. So this is great. I think this is a great addition to the code here because it gives a lot more detail. Again, new code, old code. And then this is just a takeaway. Going to M here, I'm going to try to speed this up. Going to M, it's a lot of information here, guys, so just bear with us on the time. So the soup and stock kettles, so this is the old way on what it looked at. And you're going to see here, there's not much takeaways of the new code. It pretty much states the exact same thing. So really, again, you're just adding up the total volume, and you're looking at table 2 on these soup and stock kettles. Again, this is what the new code says. In walks, old code says add 1,617 cubic inches and see table 2. Great. New codes, a lot more detail. So it talks about that 17 cubic inches for walks, but also talks about a minimum of 34 cubic inches shall be added to the aggregate volume of table 1 when calculating a grease interceptor or removal device for a half size or smaller combination ovens with automatic or manual cleaning cycles. So it goes into a little bit more detail. It even talks about a minimum of 4851 cubic inches. Again, looking at table 1. So it doesn't just touch on walks now. It also talks about ovens as well within the code, and it tells you what those cubic inches will be. And it goes to table 1 where the walks are looking at table 2 when adding up those cubic inches to determine the gallons per minute. So that's really the big change here on N is the update. Is it looks at the ovens now versus just a walk. Going to O, kitchen hoods, old code is looking at the discharges needed to go to the grease interceptor, sizing using, and it's funny, it said good engineering practice or peak flow is exactly what the code used to say on O. New code is very similar to that, but it's also added kitchen hoods, which may extract grease from cooking operations, must be made to receptacles or floor drains, and they need to go to the grease interceptor. Old code said that as well. Minimum flow rate of these required grease interceptors, look at table 2 for these automatic hood wash units shall be equivalent to such unit discharge rate in gallons per minute as indicated on the manufacturer's specification sheet or based on the number of gallons of water the device uses per wash cycle or based on the length of the hood system. 0.7 gallons per minute per foot, whichever is greater. So that's the new code. Again, a lot more description on exactly what's what versus the old way. It just gives a brief summary of what is getting discharged or connected to the interceptor. So new code, further description here, guys. So when looking at P, I'm moving on, old code, small grease traps with a minimum ASME or PDI certification start at 4 GPM. If you're putting a 4 GPM inside of a kitchen, you're not doing justice for your client or end user. It's basically the size of a shoebox. That thing will fill up immediately within 1 day. So just keep that in mind. I would never put something that small. I would always start off at least at a 20 GPM just to give some leeway and some capacities, because anything smaller than that, you're not going to have any grease storage at all within the system. And it's going to be a disaster for your client in the long term. The update to that, I'm not going to read this word for word, but it takes out that 4 GPM and it talks about parallel connections when needing a larger capacity. So old way, new way. Q, proper installation and maintenance for common sense clause. Again, this was the old way, guys, on what it was said in the code. Again, you can see here, these are very brief descriptions. The photos were added by me. Going to what the new way code says. This is quite different. I do want to mention towards the bottom on maintenance, it does say, however, the minimum cleaning frequency shall be such that the accumulated fats, oils, and grease and solids do not exceed 25% of the total liquid depth that the grease interceptor or automatic device was designed to. So that's kind of a new thing. This has nothing to do with certifications. This has everything to do with maintenance. So that's all this has to do with maintenance. And this is really for your end user. It has nothing to do with the designs, because again, the other letters has to do with everything to do with the designs. So that's the update with Q. R, old way, alternate designs are cool as long as they're done by an engineer with an NY state license. And so it's funny, you see this photo down below. Yes, that is a handmade grease interceptor. That would never be accepted in New York City or probably anywhere in the US. New way, nothing's changed. Pretty much exactly what the old way said. S basically states old way, no grandfathering or existing installations must conform within a year of publications. The updated here, instead of 1 year, it now says no later than 90 days after this effective date. So that's if those amendments to the sections persistent to the application filed before such an effective date must conform to the specific requirements to the section. Now, it does talk about the no later than 1 year after the effective date of the amendments of this section, but basically notwithstanding any other provision of this section, existing grease interceptors must conform to the specific requirements of this section. So if a restaurant's moving in and they've got different equipment, everything's going to have to be updated to the new grease interceptor if it doesn't meet the old interceptor. That's pretty standard across the board on a national level. That's just to make sure that, again, everything's sized correctly, that the flow rate is correctly going into the system. T, old way. This is kind of the authorities can do whatever they want clause. Basically, at the commissioner's description, can require a grease interceptor at any time to meet or exceed the sizing in table 1 and table 2. Not much change in the update. It basically says the exact same thing. And so I do want to mention, guys, this is important because the old code stopped right here. We have 2 brand new letters. U is brand new. And I'm glad they've added this because this is a hot topic across the board, basically saying the use of enzyme emulsifiers or enzyme chemicals or other agents or additives in the grease interceptor devices are prohibited. The reason why the code says this is because you'll see that end users, instead of getting the interceptor pumped out, they'll just throw like these chemicals in it. And what these chemicals do is they eat the grease up in the interceptor, but later down the line, it basically comes back together where now all of a sudden the grease reaccumulates within the sanitizer line, and it's going to create major blockages down in the actual sanitary line. So these are pretty much outlawed across the board in almost every city and every major jurisdiction. So this is brand new to the code, letter U. Another one that's brand new, and this is the last part of the code digest, is that they've added V, and this just really talks about yellow grease. And really, this should not ever get routed to a grease interceptor. This is completely different from what we consider brown grease. Brown grease is what your commercial fixtures, you know, like your mop sink, 3-comp, floor drains, all those other fixtures, prep sink, they're producing brown grease. Yellow grease is cooking oil. This is going to require a basically different collection, and where all these restaurants, they basically have these drums that they just put all this in there, and it gets collected by a completely different, you know, pumper collector versus going with brown grease. So just keep that in mind, guys. This has been added to the code, and it even states that each time it's picked up, it's made from the establishment. And so it just kind of gives a brief analysis of what that is. So Mike, I've got question 4 up on the screen now. Let's do the polls again. Let me know when I can move on, Mike.
We'll do just a couple requests come in for the presentation. Is it all right if we send a copy out to people?
Absolutely. Absolutely, guys.
And we've got about 65% reporting. Give a couple more seconds. All right, back to you, Paul.
All right. So we've talked about the standards that govern grease interceptors. We looked at both code digests, which was the SCA and what they say in their code, as well as Title 15. We looked at the old way and all the new updated changes. That's a lot of information, guys. I don't expect you to get this right away, but it's important that we address this because this is what's required when going through plans review. We want to make sure that you guys, when you submit, that it's an easy thing so you're not going back and forth and you can get your jobs done faster. So let's talk about sizing grease interceptors, and this is where we're going to get into the grease production sizing method. This is the question that we hear all the time. When do I service my interceptor? This comes up all the time because really there's not a lot of codes that, almost all codes don't really address this. It just tells you how to size it, and then it's like, all right, I'm done. It's sized, you know, good luck. Where as an end user, if I own a restaurant, like sometimes I don't even know I had one until I get a knock from the inspector, or because I've never serviced it, or I just have no idea when I need to. So this is going to be a great addition to what the code says. So we'll kind of get into this because this comes up all the time from your guys' clients that we talk to, as well as just national brands are always looking at, like, when do I service my interceptor? Well, we've got a calculation for you to figure that out. So I want to mention something to you guys. What's wrong with this picture? We've got a sandwich joint. Let's just call it, you know, a deli shop, mom and pop joint in Brooklyn. And we've got this really nice Mexican restaurant there as well. The sandwich shop is all done, you know, on throwaway ware, disposable, where the Mexican joint, it's all served on plates. Code.
Hey, Paul.
Yep.
Paul, I'm sorry to interrupt. There's some people that need to jump off. Can we pop up the 5th question?
Yes. sorry guys, and I apologize. This went well past the time.
I'll
Fifth
I'll
question.
launch it. You don't have to go to it.
There we go. And straight up, guys, I haven't even got to this to like give you the answer. Mike, do you want me to just tell the answer because I haven't even said it yet?
Yeah, we can probably help them out here on this one.
So I'll just go to the slide on that kind of talks about that. Okay. So Mike, you got the poll up. That's kind of what I'm looking at there.
Yeah, I can't go to the slide. You got to have the poll there. So.
Well, the answer is 2016, guys. I apologize. It's gone a little bit further than what we intended.
Yeah, we just want to make, we want to make sure we get, get these 5 questions in, so there's no questions from the Practicing Institute for those who need the credits.
Yep.
And we're going to close that out and go back to the rest of the presentation.
Perfect. And guys, we'll send out a copy. And really, I'm touching on sizing. This is going to probably be another 10 minutes. I was going to do a demonstration of Grease Monkey. I still can afterwards if some of you want to sit in on it. And again, I didn't mean for this to go well past an hour. So getting back to this slide, what's wrong with this picture? There's a lot of things. When you're just sizing by code, it doesn't play into the fact on what type of food that they're actually making and how that can actually change what grease interceptor you go with. And so that's where the grease production sizing method comes in hand. And so the ASME handbook, which I'm sure a lot of you have copies of and are part of ASME, American Society of Plumbing Engineers, this was published in chapter 8 of the handbook, which we're so proud of because we've been preaching the grease production sizing method since 2012, and we actually got this published in 2016, the handbook, and it's our sizing method. And so it's backed by a major organization, and we also have other municipalities that have adopted this within their code. Miami, Florida, Omaha, Nebraska, Chicago, Illinois has also adopted this. Arlington, Virginia, right outside Washington, D.C. And there's several that are also coming on board because what it does is it doesn't just size by flow rate. It looks at step 2, and step 2 is sizing by grease capacity. And so the calculation is easy. Minimum starting point is plumbing code. What's my flow rate? Or with DEP says table 1, table 2, you still size that way. But step 2 now, this is where it gives you a pump out cycle that your clients can actually follow and make sure that they stay code compliant through their entire time that they're operating that restaurant. And so it's broken up into a low, medium, or high grease producer. And so all we're doing, guys, is taking meals per day times the load factor. And you can even do, if you don't know meals per day, you can do the square footage or seats. We can always convert that back to meals per day. And then you do that by, is it a low, medium, or high grease producer? Are they serving flatware or no flatware? Our example, if it's that deli shop, it's all disposable ware. You have a lot less dishes to wash every single day versus the Mexican restaurant that's serving everything on flatware because every dish has to be washed, which is putting more grease down the line. So that's why this is so important. And at the end of the day, it gives you a grease capacity needed. So I'm going to take you through one quick example of Olive Garden. So looking at table 1 and table 2, so this is the new table, assuming that we sized based off all the fixtures that were within this commercial kitchen, that code says we need 100 GPM, minimum size. Okay, I could tell you right now for this Olive Garden, 200 pounds is probably only going to get me a week or maybe 2 weeks for a pump out cycle because the interceptor is going to fill up that fast if it's a minimum capacity interceptor. And so if you take it through the grease production sizing method, assuming they're doing 250 meals per day at a high grease producer with flatware on a 90-day pump out cycle, this commercial kitchen produces about 1,024 pounds of grease. And so code based off fixtures was saying we need 100 GPM But based off the grease production sizing method, we're looking at, yes, we need 100 GPM, but on capacity to make sure that we can pump out every 90 days. And again, it doesn't have to be 90-day, guys. If your client wants to pump out once a month or, you know, every other month, or if they want to do every 2 weeks, you're just playing with those numbers to figure out how much pounds they're going to generate within that time period of pump out cycle. So based on this, 1,024 pounds, well, unfortunately, the graph jumps up pretty far once you hit past that 1,000 GPM. You have to go with a 2,000 pound. And as we all know, these are literally massive steel tanks if you went with a PDI rated grease interceptor. They're huge. They're almost the size, like they're probably over a couple thousand square feet. They're that big when dealing with a 1,000 GPM, 2,000 pound steel PDI rated interceptor. Again, PDI doesn't even rate that far, but DEP will accept if you have interceptors that are rated to PDI and you make factory rated ones, they'll accept a factory rated one in place. But for Schier, for this example, we could get away with our GB250 at 100 GPM because the unit's certified to 1,895 pounds of grease. So this is great because we're not going with the minimum size here. We still meet it on flow rate, but more importantly, we're giving your client enough capacity that they can operate within that pump out cycle. So I had mentioned, so we talked about sizing. Grease Monkey does all this for you, literally. It makes it so easy that you guys literally put all the fixtures, all the information, and it's going to size by DEP. And you can do it two different ways, guys. If you just want to go minimum capacities, we can do that. Or if you want the larger capacity with grease, we can do it that way. And so we also do a free pre-approval. This is so important because when you guys are doing jobs, all, you know, if you're doing them all within that Northeast, or even when you're getting out of the Northeast, the 5 boroughs, you size this way by Title 15. When you get into Suffolk County or Nassau County, sizing is done completely different from what DEP says. When you get into the Hudson Valley area, every city, or even like Westchester County, they all do it different on how they size. Jersey, every township does it different. And so this is going to be your greatest friend right here, Grease Monkey, because at the end of it, you can hit pre-approval. We will make sure what you typed into Grease Monkey, we will reach out to the jurisdiction, or we could check your sizing to make sure that it meets the code and that it will be approved before it gets submitted through plans. This is a free service we offer. It's right on our website. And I'm not going to take you through it, but I'm just going to go to our website. This is our homepage. Literally, if you go to Grease Monkey, it takes you straight to it. If you don't, now you're going to want to create your own login, and you go to Get Started. Excuse me. Once you create your own login, you are live and you have your own account. And you'll be able to size hundreds of interceptors. It's basically your own personal dashboard is what it's going to do for you. It's going to act as an organizer. It's also going to be able to size multiple jobs. You can clone projects. So let's say you're working with a certain client that has the same prototype kitchen on pretty much every design. You could literally put one in there and clone it and then just throw 100 different addresses at it, and we'll get every single one pre-approved before it goes through plans. So I want to mention this to you guys because we've been doing this service for the last, I would say, 10 years. And this has really been for our national accounts. We have several of them. Anyone from Starbucks, Target stores, Jersey Mike's, Wingstop. And what we've done with these national accounts, since they're working in so many different cities, or they're building in so many different cities, their biggest complaint has always been, man, we can never get the consistent intercept. Like, we can't get the same interceptor approved in every city because every city has their own way of sizing or what's allowed. And also, we can't get consistent pricing across the board. So what we can do for you guys is we can get consistent approval across the board, as well as consistent pricing for all of our products. We have over 350 stocking partners within the US, and we've got probably close to 18 of them right there within around the New York City metro. So the access to our product is same day, and we can do pre-approvals for you at a really fast pace because we've already built out what we call a jurisdictional database. So you saw the login. I encourage everyone to get on there and play with this. We've already got a lot of signups, but this is something, again, this is going to be your greatest tool and friend for when sizing grease interceptors on how you can do that. And at the end of the day, when you go to the summary part, we even give you an elegant PDF of the sizing calculations that you can literally paste it, throw it right on your plans, because they're going to want to see this, but we can change this to make it where it interacts with Title 15. So keep that in mind. Again, every code's unique. And so depending on where you're doing a job at, if you're doing a job in Connecticut, it's completely different from every national code because they have their own independent code. And so we have all this on our database, and we'll be able to get you answers at a pretty fast pace. So that was question 5. We've already hit on that. Again, this sizing method can be used for any interceptor. And Mike, I do want, if guys or girls, if you guys have time, I'll take you through an example through Grease Monkey. But at the end of the day, it basically makes sure that happy code authorities and happy end users, because you're sizing correctly by code, but you're also giving them that extra capacity that they need to do longer pump out cycles, and that will help them save them tremendous money over time.
Paul, there was a question about recommended pump out cycles, whether it be weekly, monthly, bi-monthly. And I know that in the past, when I've used Grease Monkey, it always kind of defaults to 90 days. And
yep,
we always change it whenever we do a New York City one, because there's never enough room in a place to do a 90-day pump out cycle. I don't know if you want to just touch on that briefly while you have a minute.
Absolutely. No, that's a great question. So Grease Monkey does size for 90 days, and that's just basically the industry standard. Now, when you submit it through Grease Monkey, we can change to whatever pump out cycle you want, or whatever the end user or your client is requesting. So the one thing with New York City, or the 5 boroughs, we actually have unique requirements already filtered in Grease Monkey. And so when I log in here, when I go to a new project, it's not going to actually going to give me a recommendation, because New York City it has such unique requirements, unlike any other code. We already have this built in, so we're not actually going to give you guys a recommendation until you hit submit, and that's when we can start changing everything. And so you see here, I just logged in underneath mine. It says this, that, hey, Schier has extensive experience with NYC DEP code. And again, it's not going to, you have to submit it to Schier to make sure that we meet the intent of DEP, so that you're not getting this back and forth or denial notes. And that comes to the pump out cycle. That goes to anything, however you want it to be. And so we just ask you guys, when you're filling this out, try to make it as accurate as possible. So when I go to the fixtures, you're going to preload all your fixtures here, and we're going to automatically convert those to the table 1 and table 2 for you. So we basically do this. So as long as you put all the fixtures that are going to be connected, we'll make sure we get you the appropriate size interceptor. Now, if you're doing a job in the 5 boroughs, it's not going to give you a recommendation until you submit it, and then we manipulate everything back to what the code says, okay? So you won't get a recommendation right away until it gets submitted to our sizing expert, and then they'll be able to transition everything back to table 1 and table 2 for you and get you the appropriate pump out cycle. Turnaround time on this, you're looking at 1 to 2 days. That's how fast it is to get you an answer on this. Literally, it's that fast to convert everything to the table 1 and table 2. And so as long as you fill it out correctly, we're going to make sure that you get the correct recommended size. I'll be more than happy to go through an example with you guys if anyone wants to stay on here. I know we're well past the hour. We're 30 minutes past it, but I'll be more than happy to do that. Mike, just let me know if you want me to do that or not.
I think we've had, there's quite a few people that have dropped off. If there is anyone that wants to stay on, if someone wants to just message in the question box. I know there was a question that came in. I think if Jim Parisi still wants to ask you directly, it looks like he's signed off as well. So, so I haven't seen any messages come in. So
I would encourage you guys to definitely sign up, play around with it if you haven't already. But I mean, there's nothing out there like this, and I've heard that by several engineers. In our database right now, we've got over 3,000 engineers using this on a daily. So we've had it out for 2 years now, Grease Monkey, and it's completely taken off. The reason why we haven't hit, this NYC really hard with this, because we didn't have the local requirements built in yet. We want to make sure before we showed you that it meets the intent of the code, and so now it does.
All right.